Whether we're looking at a government educational system that has deprecated actual education in favor of indoctrinating children with various woke ideologies, or a higher education system which turns its graduates into debt peons in exchange for not actually providing them with much in the way of a life of the mind, and again focusing primarily on the enforcement of postmodern progressivism. It's quite clear that the educational system throughout its entire scope is broken. And the current institutions don't really look like they're amenable to being fixed. That raises the question of, what do we do about that? How do we fix education for the next generation? Not just in terms of homeschooling, for example, is one possible solution to that, or charter schools, those kinds of things. There are numerous solutions that have been proposed for the education of children, but higher education as well. What do we replace that with, if anything? Can the institutions be fixed? Perhaps I'm wrong about that. And if they can't, and we have to start building our own institutions, or perhaps do without institutions entirely, what are some of the possible pitfalls that we could find ourselves in as we leverage this sort of like ersatz academy that is gradually developing online with influencers in the place of scholars, for example. So that, I think, kind of frames overall what we want to talk about. I suppose another aspect of it would be to go back to first principles and ask, what is the purpose of education? What are we really trying to accomplish here? So I'll open the floor. Who wants to go first?
Just say, I mean, which I agree with that question. It's just I'm going to start with, and as far as I know, the original purpose of public education was training people to be citizens, for their responsibilities, duties of citizenship, to understand, enough to participate as voters or jurors or, whatever, holding some kind of civic office or whatnot. And it seems like now, I mean, anytime you hear education discussed, it's always in the context of preparing people for the workplace, for the economy, for jobs. It's just, and that whole bit about citizenship has been left out, unless it's some kind of wokest indoctrination to more turn people into subjects rather than citizens. But I guess it's a question, and I'm curious what you guys think, if particularly with the public education system or any involvement by the government. I mean, one, if you think that the government should have any involvement in it, and if the government does, or if there's some kind of central authority that does, is it a legitimate goal to worry about jobs and, training for the market? Should that be something that's left to the, whatever, the free market itself? Should the government just stick to like the basics required to get people ready for citizenship, or, what should be the goal? Do you think the job aspect of it is legitimate? And just throwing that question out there.
Yeah, I think that there's always been this kind of utilitarian element in public education or compulsory schooling, basically. And I think the history is that that they kind of put it forward, this idea basically to train the peasants to become workers, right? Because before it wasn't like really that important to be able to read and write and that kind of stuff. If you were a farmer, right? And they kind of introduced these systems basically to make people able to participate in like the more modern workplace, i.e. As the workers in factories and that sort of thing, where you just needed to have a little bit of education. And I think there's this book, I forgot the name, Dumbing Down of America, might be it, where it's basically argued that as all the good things in the world, this comes from Germany, like that Prussia actually invented this this system where, right, with the bells, you know, that so you have a math class and you have the bell. It's basically like a factory, right? So and it was modeled on that idea. So there's one aspect of it. I mean, there's probably a lot more to the history of schooling, obviously, but I think the utilitarian aspect, or even the cynical aspect, right, is basically train those people so they can work for us, kind of thing, was always a thing in that discussion, right? And also, if we talk about the higher purposes, you know, like as you alluded to, like to become a citizen or to, you know, participate in public life, I think that's probably a bit more of a discussion about higher education. To my mind, it's sort of an elite building, and it used to be that in the universities clearly were fulfilled that role, right, for a long time. And part of it was also that it was just very few people who went to university, and by that nature, it was a kind of elite building apparatus, because it was few people, and it didn't really matter too much, you know, what you learned, but like the social milieu that you hung out with, and then, but you also learned better, right, in that kind of milieu. So that's another aspect, I think, when you talk about like the higher ideals. And then what happened with mass university, right, is that this couldn't, I mean, it's no wonder that this whole thing broke down, basically, right? Because there's just two ideas that don't go together, like this exclusive elite network kind of thing, right, on the one hand, and then the mass factory university, where they basically took the old let's train them all, you know, so they can work for us model from like primary education and applied it to university. So, and this just doesn't work, right? So we kind of lost the higher ideals, but also the quality of education and all of that. At least I think that's one aspect to the whole story. There are many more, but yeah, I passed the what do you say?
Yeah, the baton, the speaking stick.
The baton,
John Taylor Gatto wrote quite a bit about these origins of education in the Prussian education model, where it was all specifically organized to acclimatize the students to be perfect factory workers. So you had the age segregated classes that made them, they were like shifts, you know, and the bells were shift changes, and the report cards were their paycheck and all of that. And his main critique, I think, was that was not actually a good way to educate children if you wanted them to be good citizens and self-actualized human beings and all of that kind of thing. But in many ways, I think the contemporary public education system doesn't really resemble that as much as it used to, because they're not trying to make factory workers anymore. Now they want, or citizens for that matter, now they want good consumers who, you know, don't ask too many questions and go with the flow and all of that. They want compliant office workers who will work in teams doing sort of meaningless make work tasks that don't necessarily connect to any larger obvious goal, and spread the credits throughout the group, and all sort of very similar to the modern office environment.
Also, I would just interject quickly that I think what they also want is.
You turned your mic off.
I think that they also, I think that they also want like compliant, or at least let's say, overly credulous voters.
Yes.
Does that make any sense? Go
Yes,
ahead,
of
continue.
course.
I
course.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Overly credulous voters who think that they are not credulous, hence the emphasis on critical thinking, but never actually teaching them to think critically about anything. I mean, in terms of, so Daniel had the question about, do you want education to be practical? I would say, obviously, yes, but all education should be practical, ultimately. It just depends on what the final aim is that you're trying to form the child into. Are you trying to form them into a worker? Are you trying to form them into an office drone? Are you trying to form them into a corporate CEO? Are you trying to form them into an entrepreneur? Are you trying to make them into a soldier, an artist, an athlete? It all, so the form of the education that you provide them is going to determine the form of.
Hey, John, you cut out. I'll try and pick up the thread. So, but talking about who wants what, I think, I think we're beyond that. I don't think there's as much centralized control now. I think we're just living with incentives. I think it's a lot like the COVID era and the confusion there. There's a lot of different people that want a lot of different things. Class interest plays a role. I think at the end of the day, education, much like everything else, I think probably education more than anything else, there's no one size fits all solution. And the idea that society needs X or, one particular thing, I don't think anybody knows that answer. And so the hubris that it takes to force children to go do all the same stuff in accordance with, initially it was, the Rockefellers, and John Dewey and John mentioned John Taylor Gatto, who covers all the history of that. But today, I think what we're left with is we had a centralized system. And like all systems and institutions, it's been captured by ideologues. In this case, it's egalitarian ideologues. And egalitarianism just doesn't mesh well with education at all, because there's such a disparate level of ability and interest between individuals, such that one ideology is not appropriate for every person, and capacities are widely different. And so if you try and make that fit, it creates a completely dysfunctional system built on stupidity and lies. And that's what we're dealing with today. And Luke referenced that with, you had this elite institution of the university, and now everybody goes to university. Well, everybody's got to go. Well, then it's not an elite institution. And you have an overproduction of people trying to fill intellectual roles, and not everybody's an intellectual or wants to be. And so I don't think that there's any systems solution to this. And so like the opposite of that, in the other direction is the free market, but that's not specific. That just means that different people following their own interest and risking their own capital that's going to be the only solution to the problem, because any centralized solution is going to just inevitably get co-opted again by the most virulent of ideologues, which is in this case, egalitarians, and their complete divorce from the reality that there are differences between people. Since I cut off John or went to fill in the gap, I'll go ahead and pass it back over to him.
Nope. Mark had his hand up first.
Mark,
No, that's okay, John, because you cut out at a certain point, like kind of mid-sentence. I'm kind of curious to hear you finish your thought before I go.
I actually totally forgot what I was going to say. I'm just going to riff off of what Grant was saying, but since I'm already talking, you're absolutely correct with the egalitarian thing. I always chafed against that when I was in elementary and high school, that it felt that the tall poppies got cut down, the nail that stuck out got hammered down, that kind of thing. It felt like resources were being lavished on the sort of bottom end of the spectrum in order to try to bring them up a bit. And at the top end, the most promising students were often kind of ignored, which just, struck me as unjust. And I was also constantly annoyed that I wasn't able to just learn what I wanted to learn sort of as I wanted to learn it. And moving out of the institutions and adopting a kind of ethos of autodidacticism does, like, the internet offers the tools to do that in an incredibly powerful way. But here's one of the dark sides, is that there are some things that aren't fun to learn, but are very necessary to learn, or they are not fun to do. They are perhaps even painful to do, but they're very necessary to do, or at least very helpful to learn how to do. So in a lot of, at its best, the sort of institutional educational system is about sort of forcing students to do the things they don't really want to do. For example, wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go for a 5-mile run. Very few people will do that on their own. Or learn multivariable calculus, or algebra and geometry, or even rudimentary physics. These things are not things that people will generally do sort of in their spare time, just because, some might, but you often have to be kind of forced to learn how to do the difficult things. And that was something that I kind of would seek out from institutions, was precisely that sort of external pressure of, you have to have this problem set in at this time. You have to, the exam is at this time and you have to be ready by then, in order to force myself to learn things that, like, frankly, I'd be too lazy to otherwise. And I think that's one of the possible pitfalls that we're going to go into, is if we sort of move towards this more sort of self-driven autodidactic style of education, where there's a real danger that it just degenerates into infotainment. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, man. Okay, so everybody said a lot of interesting things. I'm trying to tie them together in my mind, because honestly, when the topic was picked, I was like, wow, that's a broad topic, but I think that we're all kind of leaning in the same direction. Like, we all agree, system busted beyond repair, pretty much. But the one thing I thought about is, like, what kind of system are we talking about? Like, even before COVID, and even before all the schools kind of turned into these madrasas of progressive pseudo-religion, whatever they are, I think that there was already a problem. And I was trying to think of, like, how I was educated growing up in the 80s and 90s. And the closest model that I could think of, and I kind of went and revisited it before this conversation, was the, let's say, the early imperial model of Rome. And so I kind of reinvestigated that, and I found some interesting corollaries. It started, in again, early imperial Roman version of education. It starts at around age 6 with ludus, and in ludus, you essentially don't have a physical location for the classroom, and you don't really have a stable sort of pool of students either, because, autodidacts aside, what would happen is that students would be put into the system, promoted into the system by their parents. Usually they were wealthy, but there was actually a slight variability in class, in sort of social class, that attended these schools. But what would happen is, over time, you'd have ludus, which was the kind of the fundamentals, the reading, the writing, basic logic, basic math. And then some of those students, whoever were the most talented, whoever were the most driven, whoever's parents had the highest prospects, whether it was in politics or law, they would go on to the next type of school, which was Grammatica. And so there was a filtering process along the way. It was like, early on, it was sort of like, yes, we want, the empire wants, what serves the interest of empire is for the maximum number of people to have the basics of a set of skills in order to interact and transact with each other across what was becoming a very complex, a larger and very complex empire. And then, of course, like, and then, they would be, a lot of them would like go into trades, or they would transact as merchants or soldiers or what have you, but they would find a place before the age of 14, where they said like, okay, that's enough education for you, go and live and serve the empire. And so when I thought about it, I think like, well, I grew up in an imperial system like that. We all kind of, everyone's been sort of throwing in these ideas about what it is that we were being trained to do. And I think that, John touched on basically all of them, that what we need to do is service the economy. And like, primarily, it was still somewhat as laborers when I was growing up, but I agree that it's become something more like be compliant consumers, whether it's of goods or information or propaganda or what have you. But I still found something really interesting about the Roman model, because I think if we're talking about developing a parallel system, not even a competitor, but something that lies completely outside of the imperial framework and exists in parallel to it, it would probably be something like, it would probably start with something like the ludus. It would probably start, and this is an idea that my wife and I have like talked about again years before COVID, looking at the lowering of standards, looking at the psychological and emotional manipulation that was going on. So what we thought of is there's this growth in homeschools and there's this growth in charter schools. And we thought, what if we married both of those things and added the conceptual framework of ludus, and that whole, evolutionary lineage, and said, okay, there is no physical classroom. There are students that are a pool of students, multiple pools of students, based on a geophysical territory, a community, whatever you want to call it, somewhere within physical range of each other. And so what would happen was, I think that you would hire these parents, these families, they would pool their resources. And then they'd go and hire a group of tutors, right? Like essentially a set of really talented teachers that have either been disenfranchised by the current system or just totally disgusted by it and want out. And maybe it's financial prospects, but I have a feeling that a lot of it will be like sort of a moral imperative, or that they've been chased away by the rainbow crowd.
Sorry, Mark, I just want to interject. So in 2020, after the lockdowns and the schools were all shut down and moved to Zoom, one of the interesting developments was the pod schools, which was almost exactly what you're describing. It was sort of parents getting together, pooling their resources and hiring a teacher, frequently a teacher who was leaving the mainstream school system, and just paying that teacher themselves to teach their children. So, which is much more affordable than trying to hire a tutor just for your own kids, because you're splitting the cost amongst 5 or 6 families, basically recreating like the one-room schoolhouse. I agree. It's similar to that. I think I was going to go a little bit further though and say that what I'm looking at is more of a network model that's ultra flexible and like custom tailored to a degree that you're essentially having. So what I see is kind of like an organically developing, I don't know, you call it like a satellite array of classical educators and students that are all, and like as far as physicality, I don't know how the pods were working, but like what I thought of is that, something along the lines of the carpooling model, where you would say like, well, the classroom is in this family's home today, and tomorrow it's in this family's home. And the next day, maybe it's in, I don't know, a park, like that you could vary it up to the point where everybody's also sharing kind of the responsibility of nurturing this environment. And so and by opening up
your homes to people. Like, it would also, I think, in a weird way, like, encourage people to, like, well, make sure your home's in order. Like, it might have knock-on effects socially that, like, extend beyond just from the physicality of it, and just from the notion of, like, we are part of this network. We want to make it successful. We want to involve ourselves as much as possible in it. And we want to develop, like, this shared sense of knowledge that we are outside the system. And the relationships that we develop, the bonds we form, like, these kids, I think that kids that start from that kind of a platform, where they begin, you know, where moral education kind of is conducted in, you know, alongside of classical education, like, they're going to be, you're going to have, like, I think, students, even if they're not autodidacts, the students that proceed along that system, however far they decide to go with it, I think are going to be, you know, first of all, they'll be loaded up with intellectual wealth, and also spiritual wealth and awareness, and a sense of camaraderie that I don't think you would find in any traditional school, or any school that, like, at least not one that I've experienced. I grew up in the public school system. I'm essentially, you know, I'm probably the least educated guy here in that sense. But like John, you know, I was a bit of an autodidact, and not everybody can depend on that. Some people are going to have to go through the elements of training to even discover what path through life is available to them, and, like, how far they want to go with it. Let me hand it off, though, right now. Who had their hand? I think it was Daniel first, or was it Luke? Anybody know?
And Luke can go ahead and go, because what you were saying, Mark, was kind of different than what I was going to say. And so if he wants to respond to that, or give me an opportunity to think about what you said, so Luke can go ahead and go.
Yeah,
First.
so Mark, I found it really nice what you said, or, like, I can really relate to these ideas. I think it's a great way, and it's a good point, actually, to say that what's missing in education, and since for a long time, it didn't that start with the wokists and all of that, right? It's just this organic thing, this more, like, fluid kind of style, right? A bit less rigid, and I think some of the, you know, what now became woke ideas had their origin actually in quite sensible movements, right? There were, like, alternative schools, school systems that were like experimenting with different things that kind of try to break up a little bit, you know, that rigid school system. And now, of course, it has, like, degenerated in the sense that it's like, yeah, we do it like before, you know, just without any discipline, and we throw in crappy ideas, you know, but the original impulse that something is not quite right with the system, I think, is quite right. And to me, you know, my kind of utopia would be something along the lines, Mark, that you said, but maybe even going further, because I think from my own experience and from what I could observe is that the best education is actually an organic affair, right? Where a student shows a certain interest, you know, and then he kind of gravitates towards a tutor, right? I mean, just there's this bond between teacher and student, like one teacher, one student, right? That kind of forms, and the tutor then, you know, kind of encourages the student and takes him on the journey, so to say, right? That's kind of, and that might change, right? So there, in one phase, like between 12 and 14, maybe there's a strong bond between a student and one tutor, and then it's another one, right? So just, for example, imagine some guy starts being interested in cars, you know, or motorcycles or whatever, you know, as guys do, and then, you know, there's maybe one of the tutors who is also like kind of like a car guy, right? And then he can kind of take that energy, that interest, and do something with it, and you know, show the guy how to work on the car, and then throw in some physics and engineering, you know, and also like educate him that, you know, maybe if you want to go further in that, maybe you also need some advanced math, right? And just unscrewing something might not be enough, and that sort of thing. I mean, this is just one example, but I think that's really a crucial element that is missing totally these days. Is this natural, organic kind of bonds between two individuals, basically, and this tutor student relationship. I mean, I'm not sure how realistic this is, like economically and practically, but that's just, I think, what would be ideal, right? That that the individual energies and interests are organically taken into account, and discipline and all that is a function of that, and not the other way around, so to say. And then there's another point I would just want to quickly make, because I think, you know, Grant, you talked about egalitarianism and how that's bad, and I think you mean like this idea of equity, right? That everybody's basically kind of has to produce the same results. If they're not, then something's wrong with the system, right? That sort of thing. But I just want to make a quick point that egalitarianism, in the sense of meritocracy, right, that you hear a lot about these days, the critique, you know, of the woke stuff. But we need a meritocracy, and you know, the best people should be rewarded or whatever. But just one point about that, because in France, arguably, it's the most meritocratic system in the world. I don't know, but it might be. But it has socialist roots, right? It comes from the French Revolution, and the idea is basically to say, okay, we don't care if it's a farmer, you know, or if it's a nobleman. If the guy is good, then he should be promoted, should make a career, right? That's this kind of like socialist idea. And the thing is, in France, you have this crazy and really tough educational system where you have basically these challenges, they call it concours, where students compete, you know, and then they do a ranking, and then the best ones get to the best schools and on universities and all that. And it's like, it's extremely hierarchical and super tough. I mean, people just go nuts in this system, right? I mean, it's extremely tough, and it produces some outstanding results, it must be said. But it's also extremely crushing to the spirit, and many talented people just fall off, you know, because it's just crazy. It's just a warning, you know, against this. If you can take this idea of meritocracy a bit too far as well, and it's just if you set it up in such a technocratic way, I'm not sure it's always the best idea. And I kind of feel that we might have to question like the whole package and really, as Mark said, go back to something more organic, something just deeper and more human, and just more suitable to just how humans are, right? And how we learn, how we grow up, and how we develop. All right, Dan, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So, you know, thinking of a lot of these different complaints about education or ideas for fixing this, like there's this, it seems like these separate issues, but they're connected in some way. And, you know, kind of thinking over that, like, well, how are they connected, or what's kind of some of the root stuff? I think not the only thing that connects a lot of these problems with education, there's this quote from C.S. Lewis, and I can't for the life of me remember which book of his it was in. I think it was one of his essays, but he said there's two different reasons for valuing or supporting democratic forms of government. You know, one legitimate, one really naive. And the legitimate reason for supporting democratic forms of government is saying, well, people are so inherently corruptible by power that it should be decentralized as much as possible, broken up as much as possible. And, you know, the best way to do that is to form some kind of, not necessarily, you know, absolute democracy, but maybe a representative democracy or something like that, right? Where you break up to try to put as many firewalls as you can between, the accumulation of power and the abuse of it and all that. The other illegitimate reason for supporting a democratic form of government is this naive belief, which has taken over our culture today, that everybody has such a valuable opinion. Everybody's got such that they need to make their voice heard. Everybody should participate equally because everybody's special and everybody's got something worthwhile to say, and everybody's got, and that has informed a lot of the education, like John brought up earlier, about the way the trend towards gutting, and that's only accelerated since our generation, gutting advanced or gifted programs and just dumping resources on the bottom, half, really. It seems like very wasteful, but it comes back to this idea. Nobody wants to draw, for whatever reason, this distinction that some people just aren't cut out for that kind of thing, a higher form of learning or and now you got the DEI initiatives, which compound that egalitarian impulse, where you're going to get rid of standardized tests or anything that could produce a disparate outcome for some groups versus others, because we'd rather not have, results come up that are unflattering to one group or even one individual, so we'll get rid of standards and that'll solve that. And then we'll, a comparison that's interesting is the way with athletics programs, we have no problem chalking up somebody's, say like Michael Jordan, right? Like you look at him and it's like, granted, he had to work his ass off, train and all that to become who he became in terms of basketball. But there was something where you could take 1,000 different guys trying to play basketball, with Michael Jordan being one of them, and 999 people drawn at random. And there's something that they can all practice the same amount, train the same amount. And Michael Jordan, there's something there. He's got some inherent or incipient, if I'm pronouncing that, incipient talent that's going to shine through, where the work that he does is going to achieve a greater result. He'll get more bang for his buck, so to speak, than I would if I was to try to, as a 15-year-old kid or whatever, go all in for basketball. And so we'll do that with like sports. It's okay to have a sports team that you have to try out for. You can get cut. Not everybody gets the same playing time. When it comes time for college, again, you may not get into the school you want. You have to, at least for the male athletics, you got to be, especially for the big ones, basketball and football, you got to be really good. You got to, meet a certain standard. We have no problem with that. But when it comes to intellect and anything that might measure that, there's this reluctance to acknowledge hard differences among individuals or third rail among different groups. You may have, for whatever reason, the differences come up and nobody wants, there's this reluctance to say that there could be anything, any kind of incipient talent there that some people have in greater abundance than others. It's like, we'll do it for physical stuff, for athletics or whatever, but we won't do it for academics. And it kind of comes back to this, this notion that pervades our culture, where it's like, everybody's so valuable, everybody's got something special to say, everybody needs to be encouraged, nobody's better than anybody else, like that whole handicapper general, or what, Henry Bergson story by Kurt Vonnegut, where it's like, you can't bring everybody up, so what do? You got to push the achievers down. You got to lower the standards and create this false, maybe that's anyway, there's a lot of different, all this sort of stuff seems to be interrelated. You got the feminine virtues of trying to cultivate a sense of belonging and nurturing, rather than the more strict discipline that's just traditionally associated with fathers, that kind of thing. So maybe there's that. Maybe there's this overarching theme in our culture where a lot of schools originally were done for religious purposes, like people of the book, so to speak, with Jews, as Muslims and Christians, doing some sort of religious education. And the religion of our culture has gone from, I guess, maybe the materialism / mercantilism, wanting people to be workers and money makers, to like now it's consumers. And that's a way of, we're all equal, we all have something valuable to contribute, right? Just in terms of anybody that's got a dollar, doesn't matter how talented or capable you are, if you've got money to spend, you're a consumer, you can be treated like a king, the customer is always right, that kind of thing. And it's like you see that play out in our education, where now, especially at the college level, there's huge grade inflation, and I'm sure, John, with your more recent experience in academia, you could attest to this. There's the it's not like the students are supposed to come in and rise to the standard. It's like professors, especially among maybe not the elite schools, but more on the lower end, community colleges and such, even that you can't fail the students. You got to figure out a way, if they just will even show up to class and turn something in, even if it's garbage, you're supposed to raise them up, get them past the finish line. And it's like this idea, you're a consumer of education, and that's just what you're being trained to do. And maybe, I don't know, I feel like there's a connection there between this egalitarianism and like, this is where it was going to wind up, was this sort of consumerism and just everybody's great, everybody's awesome, everybody needs to be given a seat at the table, even if they contribute nothing. That shouldn't be a bar to them getting a seat at the table and being treated as if their contributions are immensely valuable. And anyway, rambling now, so I'll pass this along. But any thoughts on that, what the underlying issue is? Do you think it is like that?
I think it's there's a grain of truth in egalitarianism, and it's that everybody is unique. So this idea that everybody's special, everybody has different potential, but for most people, and maybe not everybody, I'm not going to go full Unitarian Universalist and say that everybody has the potential to be excellent, because I don't know that that's true. But I know a lot more people have the potential to achieve excellence than do achieve excellence. I think that there's a gap in education done the right way can fill that gap. But that path to excellence varies. And that's the problem that we run into, where people superimpose their own biases on what they think is excellent onto the population at large. And if I was to criticize that the French system, as Luke was talking about, without knowing much about it, and while it does produce good outcomes, a lot of people get crushed. I think a lot of people get crushed because they're not suited to that particular type of excellence. But maybe there are types that they are well suited to, and that's what creates that soul crushing outcome for those individuals, because they sense that they're not on the path.
It's just not very good for creative types, for entrepreneurs, people who like go a bit against the grain, that sort of thing. Because it's just very conformist. And you're exactly right. I think it's just that it promotes excellence along a certain axis, but just not along others, right? So that's, I think, the issue.
Yeah, so we can't have a centralized system to sort this stuff out. It can only be decentralized. It can only be promoted by individual people that are perhaps, have achieved excellence in their respective fields. And ideally, I think we want those people leading the way to help other people with their own proclivities and personalities and potential that led them to where they are, to be able to spot that talent and create programs in order to foster that talent and develop it in those people. But with this one size fits all system that we dedicate so many resources to, not just money, just time, where you're just, you could be sitting in school knowing what you want to do at grade 3, and you still have, if it's something that requires an advanced degree, 12 or 13 years of slogging through, where if you were driven and you knew exactly what you wanted to do and you had the skill and natural proclivities to excel in that field, you might be able to do it in a fraction of the time. And there's just a one size fits all system is not flexible enough to account for that. And some people don't need very much traditional education at all in order to do exactly what they want to do. And so, John mentioned something, and I wanted to hone in on this to echo his thoughts before I pass it on, is that the idea that everybody can be an autodidact is also not accurate. Some people need the structure, and that's another example of one of those variables that individual people that understand what it takes to be excellent in a certain way, like they need to be the ones that are empowered to lead the effort here. And really empowering them is just getting the government out of the way. And so what he said is, there were times where we had, deadlines and things like that. And I had the exact same experience in PT school, which I thought was the best single program that I was ever a part of. Like the physical therapy school that the Army has is excellent. And it's very well structured, but everybody that's there wants to be there. They know exactly why they want to be there. And it's very competitive, where they make sure that you have those aptitudes in order to excel in a challenging program before you show up. And it worked very well. But there are certain programs and things that you could put together and structure them in that way, but it needs to be tailored to aptitude, where there is some sort of test and some sort of screening and vetting process to make sure that you're matching people appropriately with what they're capable of, or else some people aren't going to be able to hang, and other people it's going to be too easy. And then that doesn't create a cohesive group, where everybody's kind of, building essentially professional connections too in that environment. So, I think there's a right way to do it, but it's decentralized and it's driven by good ideas from the people that have achieved excellence in their respective fields. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree in terms of aptitude and also to some degree interest, because you have to say to some degree because interests are cultivated alongside of every other kind of social and individual development. So you're not necessarily going to some 8-year-old may know exactly what they want to be doing in 30 years, but most kids are a little bit more plastic than that, and they experiment with a variety of different things. And so in the new form of education, if it arises, and I think it'll have to almost out of necessity, I think it will be a little bit more experimental, a little bit more like a laboratory. And I think it should be to a degree, as long as it's bound in something, these pools of parents and teachers and tutors and locations, I think that what binds them needs to be somewhat solid and ethic, something that's central to all of their belief systems, to the way, to their worldview, to their view of reality. And just to talk about something that I noticed happening continually over the past decade, really, this conversation has been getting louder and louder, particularly in the cities. And what's been happening is there's been this egalitarian, I'm going to use egalitarian in 16 quotation marks. There's been this egalitarian drive to say, okay, like we're going to defund all of these gifted programs so that we could spread the money, more equitably amongst the rest of the failing school. And these are failing schools to begin with. You know, they're essentially, what it looks like is that I suspect exactly what it is. They got their hands in the cookie jar. They want more money. The bureaucrats want more money and power. And the system continues to collapse and fail. But now it's also left out the few people that could have profited from it. Maybe. Because the other thing I want to point out is this, is that I don't know, and I've been out of school for a long time now, out of primary school. And so when I was coming up, like there were two things that still existed. And one was technical education. That was an option when I was growing up. I don't know if that's necessarily an option today, or if it is, it might be a shrinking option. Because again, we're moving out of this labor model into more of this consumer, you know, / ideological model, this madrasa model. And so what I'm curious about is not just the technical aspect. I knew kids when growing up that just are like, yeah, their last couple of years of high school, they're learning how to fix cars. They're learning how to do something that's related to, or they're learning how plumbing, electrical, like that was still an option. Now, the interesting thing is this, is that our school also had a gifted program, and I was in the gifted program. And the gifted program consisted of this: for about 45 minutes per day, rather than going to a classroom, I had access to a somewhat small room within the physical school that had a bunch of books in it. And that was basically it. There was no class, there was no structure. Like, it was almost like they're saying like, you know what, you're gifted, you get to take a break from, like, you know, the more frightening aspects of public education, let's say. And that was it. You know, so it was like, even back then, you know, I'm talking about the 90s now. And even back then, there was no investment. Like, there was no like meritocracy in that sense. Like, there was nothing. It was like a badge of distinction without any sort of real merit or opportunity involved in it. And so when I take that and I try to project it forward into the 2020s, I could only imagine, you know, maybe it's nothing at all. Maybe that's why they say, hey, let's dissolve these programs. It's like, how much are we really investing in them to begin with? You know, and I think that we'd have to, if we were doing a new model, like, I would do away with that designation. I would do away with a lot of things. I would say, like, instead, we're going to see what bubbles up. You know, if a student shows aptitude suddenly or interest suddenly in a particular element, the network can be flexible enough that we say, like, we got to push this kid into this tutor network or into this part of the network, right? And like that if it's organic enough, what can happen is there's a lot of dynamic movement. It's not that you're just kind of stuck along one line. It's sort of like, you know, everybody can be reevaluated constantly, which can't happen in the current system because it's too rigid. Let me pass it along to John, though, right now. John, you've had your hand up. John, microphone. Johnny.
Earth to Mars.
Okay, let's not pass it to John right now. Let's pass it back to, I don't know. You got something to say, Luke?
Yeah, maybe just to riff a little bit of what you just said, Mark. It's interesting. Actually, I thought what they did at your school with the gifted program is actually sounds kind of cool. I mean, it's like this guy obviously is interested in all kinds of stuff.
Look, don't get me wrong, Luke. I enjoyed it in the sense that I just kind of sat around and did basically nothing but read. Yeah, but I could have, you know, I mean, good, yeah.
No, but I think, it's definitely there's room for improvement, right? I mean, it's not really a concept or anything, but I just thought it's interesting because that's basically what people do, right? If they are gifted or like self-driven, they seek out books, you know, they seek out stuff to learn, and that's what I meant with you know, when I said or talked about this more like tutor kind of system, right? Where you kind of work with the impulses that people have, that students have, and especially obviously like the gifted ones, right? That are especially interested in in certain things. And I just think that's the way it kind of has always been, really, you know, underneath it all. That's just how it works. And we are moving like in the complete opposite direction. For example, I remember when I went to school, like in the 80s and 90s as well, right? It's like it was already very rigid, like the school system. So there was not much wiggle room. I mean, we still had some teachers, you know, and those were usually the best teachers who just didn't give much didn't give a damn basically about you know, what they were supposed to teach. I mean, they kind of followed it, you know, to some degree because they had to, but they were just they also had their own interests, you know, and they gave great lectures, you know, about the stuff they cared about, and then those were the best teachers. I mean, there were not many like that, but you know, as everything went on, it got ever more rigid. So these days, from what I hear, you know, at least like the European systems I'm familiar with, it's just, it is so rigid. It has become so rigid that, you know, they literally have, the bureaucrats, you know, they have it all figured out, and the teacher basically just has to repeat line by line, you know, what some bureaucrat said. I mean, it's a bit exaggerated, but it's almost like that, really, right? They basically have to read what some bureaucrat in some ministry wrote, you know, and it's really horrible. And and despite, you know, that's also interesting, because despite all this woke thing, right, where they say, oh, we shouldn't be too hard on people, you know, we should be softer, and we shouldn't like enforce too much discipline, you know, I mean, but on the other hand, it's like this full-blown bureaucratic rigidity, right? It's really quite strange. What we actually need, I think, is less of that bureaucratic nightmare and this rigidity, and discipline where appropriate, right? But what they're doing now, it's just absolutely mind-blowing.
So now that you mentioned bureaucracy, I just got to say, that's another one of these insidious aspects of education, is that it numbs children to the stupidity of bureaucracy. So, I mean, it selects people out that are unwilling to tolerate the stupidity. You know, like you'll have bright children just dropping out saying, "This is stupid bullshit. I'm not going to put up with this for another second," and they'll drop out. And you know, some of the very astute ones that are very driven can become entrepreneurs. But if you don't have, you know, if you don't come from a higher socioeconomic status, that's, you know, a lot more difficult, because raising capital in order to get started and stuff. But it's just, yeah, that's something that you know, I think about and talk about a lot in the context of the Army, how it kind of inculcates that. But if you think about it further, as an American growing up in the public school system and then going from that into the Army, it's like once you're at the tail end of your career, you've been, you know, just tolerating the bureaucracy for 30, 40 years. And, you know, at that point, it's very difficult not to be institutionalized and come out just totally incapable of imagining a world without these stupid restraints. It's like you said, where people that are far away from where the things actually get done, that probably don't have a lot of skill, you know, just some friggin' head girl that was successful in this bureaucratic system and rose to the top, designing these policies. You know, you lose the imagination to think of how else to solve these problems. And you see that when you bring up this topic, or any topic where you're talking about these systems that are failing and trying to talk about alternatives. And like the meme with respect to government and its pervasive role, or I'd say not pervasive, outsized role in society in doing things, especially now in the United States, and how large the federal government is and how much control it has, not only over education, but everything. And like the way that it got controls through these conditional grants, and it's just not in accordance with the supreme law of the land and the Constitution. But yeah, the cliche is, well, who will build the roads, right? Who will educate the children if the government doesn't do it? You know, who will certify the teachers? You know, and it's just like, look at the outcomes. You know, it couldn't get much worse, and yet people can't imagine it. But is it any surprise that they can't imagine it? Especially government workers that spent, you know, 12 to 16 years in government schools just to go on and do a 15 to 30-year career in another bureaucracy. John, any chance you're, oh yeah, sorry, Luke, yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's first to see if John is back in the game.
Yeah, hopefully my internet holds up. So I had kind of a weird academic career in that I took several years off in between finishing my undergraduate and going to grad school, which is not typical. Most grad students, most people who go on to get their PhDs, are continuously in the institutional school system, more or less from kindergarten, if not, you know, preschool, up until they finish their terminal degree around the age of 30 or so, at which point they have spent every year of their life, more or less, oh, there's Harrison, in an institution. And during that time, they have overwhelmingly just been taking courses, doing homework assignments, reading what they're told to read, working on what they're told to work on, which is invariably homework assignments, write an essay, you know, just sort of a lot of theory, basically. They've been entirely ensconced in this world of sort of theoretical knowledge, with almost no direct practical application. And then they go on to become
disconnected from the internet.
Yeah, well, that's really a problem. John, just stay when you're back here. I try to fill the gap. But the thing about like not having any experience in real life, so to say, is really an issue. And I think these days in schools, from what I hear, you know, there are many people who want to be teachers, and especially women, of course, who just basically want to do it because it's kind of, there are nice benefits, right? You get lots of vacation. You can take a year or two off if you have a child, you know, and are guaranteed to come back, and then work for a year, you get another child. And there are many who just have it all, you know, planned out that way, right? They basically like hardly work, and it's just a sort of system that encourages that sort of thing, right? And if you just come from university, right, and you just have never like you did never filled out a tax form, you know, you never know what it means, like to earn money, you know, like to sell stuff, how this all works, you know, and not to mention like mechanical skills or like practical skills, and it's hard for, I don't know, like for students to find a connection, you know, to those people.
Yes, this is exactly. Sorry, I cut out there because my internet died again. That's exactly what I was saying. And so recently, I was watching this piece by Uberboyo, the Nietzschean YouTuber, and he was talking about his own experience in university. And he's a university dropout. I think he lasted like a year or something, and he said nuts to this. And the reason was because he went there expecting that he would be picking up practical skills in composition and rhetoric, and because you wanted to be a poet or whatever, you know, and instead it was all just theory, just, you know, in his case, literary criticism and, you know, post-structuralism and sort of all of these kinds of things that just did not interest him at all. And I think that happens because you have these people who have been inside the academic system their entire lives. they're training people who have been inside the academic system their entire lives. The only thing they know how to teach them how to do is how to be inside the academic system. And it becomes this kind of like self-referential loop that is increased.
Yeah. Let me cut in since while John's getting that sorted, because just to tail off from where he was talking first about this idea that because I felt very similar, like when I tried to go to college, and I also only lasted a year, and I hated high school. I hated school in general, and I think part of that was like this allergy to bureaucracy and to systematized thinking in general, and again, like also this, like, you know, I encountered the same thing. I thought like, okay, well, I will try college, and maybe it'll broaden my my experience of reality. I didn't have a classical education. I had an imperial one, which was not much of an education at all. And so I got there, and again, I counted the same thing: is this dog's breakfast of like all of this polluted, critical theory. It was, or at least that in its infant form, the idea that everything was subjective, this entire postmodern raft of bullshit, essentially. And I was just sort of like, well, I'm not going to get anything out of this. Like, I knew that within a year. I was like, there's nothing here that they're telling me that's A, of any worth, or B, I couldn't learn myself by picking up one of these dumb books. And so I think, like a lot of people, I think it's probably a more common experience of college than any of us really knows. And I think if you looked at a great deal of college dropouts, they might have similar stories. For instance, do any of you have similar stories? I don't know.
I would say, I mean, when you talk about college, I mean, it seems like a lot of that, you know, unfortunately, the place where I went, they allowed you to do CLEP tests, and I was in the National Guard at the time. So it's like, whatever, somehow there was something worked out with that, where if you were in the military, you could take these things for free. So I took a shit ton of, like a whole semester, almost an entire year's worth of classes with the CLEP test. But it just seems like, you know, that's something that I don't know how available it is to a lot of students, but it seems like that type of thing where you should be able to demonstrate your proficiency or whatever the subject matter is, you know, is a valuable thing, unless the schools, of course, are business, just trying to suck money out of people. So I guess they don't want people to know that. But you know, I guess that goes back to the thing of like the difference between like procedural knowledge and whatever information, and is, you know, teaching people procedural knowledge or technical knowledge, some kind of skill, as opposed to just, you know, sets of facts and you know, the whole how to think versus what to think. But I guess with procedural knowledge would include more than just knowing how to learn, you know, that and I guess that would be the question: if you're remaking or trying to reform the education system, you know, how do you distill it to where you're more so focusing on giving people the tools or the skills to, you know, become autodidacts, if they have the aptitude for that, or, you know, and or other things like you know, I guess with the classical education, you had a physical component to it too, you know, whatever, wrestling and martial stuff, and you know, whatever else, what rhetoric and things of that nature, you know. What would your dream curriculum be if you were to say, this is the essence of what a successful or basic education program should consist of? Yeah, throw that out there as a question.
Well, a part of me wants to say, just teach little kids how to read and write and some very basic calculus, and then, you know, like off there on their own. But yeah, And I think maybe another aspect we can maybe get into is that there's one function of education, I guess, that's just to provide a certain glue to society, right? To just provide a common reference ground, which, beyond all like technical or practical utilitarian things is also important for a given society, right? So just to have a sort of a canon, a sort of and it's especially in the humanities always had that sort of function, right? It was kind of like a bit like the secular priests or like the reference material that a society sort of bases its culture around, and so that's also something that I think has been lost or first subverted and then finally lost, I suppose. Which I mean, it's kind of arbitrary in a sense, right? What kind of canon that is and what kind of culture that is, but it has to be something. Yeah, so from the individual perspective, it might be not matter that much, but if we look at a society, I suppose we also need that sort of thing.
There's also, coming back to a couple of the points over the last few minutes, like with the college dropout idea, I think there's probably some different cases and different scenarios. So I think that it might even have to do with what courses, like what profession you're training for. Because I think that, like, I know a lot of people who have gone through the university system, like let's say in like STEM, in like mathematics or physics or engineering, who know exactly what they're getting into, go do it, and then make a career out of it and are satisfied with their experience for the most part. Others might be going to university for another reason and looking for something that maybe that environment and that like isn't as conducive to what they're looking for. So I'd say maybe like alternative models of education or alternative teaching methods, depending on the individual. Maybe there should be different methods in general, but also depending on what the profession or the trade or the the thing that you want to learn about is. So for me, I mean, I went to college and took music and loved it for the most part, and thought, I got exactly kind of what I was expecting. And the only thing I didn't was when the only disappointing thing, or the only thing that I didn't like was when we had to write a report in our guitar class. And I was like, I didn't come here to write reports. Like I came here to learn to play. So I got a bad mark, and my teacher was disappointed in me because I didn't put the effort into writing this report when I just really wasn't into it. But then I did a year of university. This is in Canada, so college is like a community college, and then university is like your 4-year degree, undergraduate degree. And so I just did a year of university, and yeah, just decided that wasn't really for me. Wasn't in music, and I don't know what if anything would have changed my mind. I hadn't really thought about it that much afterwards. If anything, if a different teaching modality or anything like that would have kept me in. But then again, I wasn't in STEM. I was in like philosophy, so I was doing like religious studies, philosophy, introductory courses like economics. So yeah, I don't know, different strokes for different folks, I guess is my cliched summary.
Can I get in there for a second just to address very quickly one thing? I think also, because when I proposed my, sort of satellite network, organic satellite network system for primary education, I think that the same thing might be, the same model could potentially replace the academy, because I think the academy is completely corrupted at this point. Just looking at it from the outside, is completely lost. And with it, STEM is lost. With it, obviously, any form of philosophical or classical education, even in literature, is lost. So it's all lost. But maybe it gets found if we stop thinking about the university system at all and start, again, reorganizing organically into a school of music, a school of philosophy, a school of engineering. I know that those things exist, but like, I think it's the university system that's completely polluted and corrupted that kind of staggers on. It's this great, slouching monster that is headed downhill and doesn't look like it's ever going to be repaired. And so I'm wondering, just putting that out to the floor, like, can anyone think of an example of something in history or even currently that has functioned separate from the academy in the last 500 years?
Well, I think
French salons. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head. Would be like just those sort of very informal gatherings of scholars and philosophers and scientists and so on. Well, I mean, science was largely taking place outside of the academy throughout a huge part of the last 500 years, like mostly just like informal correspondences between gentlemen scholars. Right. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking of. Like, it's like, who taught?
Which is basically like what the sort of ersatz academy is turning into. We didn't have this formalized system of master's degrees and doctorates that was until the 19th century. That was, I believe, also introduced an innovation of the Prussians, from whom everything terrible seems to come. But before that, like, it wasn't like, oh, you have a doctorate in microbiology, you are certified smart. It was just like, oh yes, this guy has written, extensively on this subject and has had interesting things to say, and people think highly of him, and he has a reputation as a result of that. It was all very, very informal. And there'd be formal recognition sometimes, like you would be elevated to a membership in the Royal Society or something like that. But that wasn't necessary in order to involve yourself, right? Although that does leave open the question of funding. So, those guys were all independently wealthy for the most part, or they would find like a wealthy patron. And
also access to a laboratory, like in the case of science, like, this is part of the pollution of the grant system, I guess. Is that
a lot of those guys would just be working out of their own house, right? Like their lab would be like in their kitchen, effectively,
in the garage. Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah, exactly. They had like a shed where their lab was. It's hard to build an ITER reactor, in like your garage, but you still see like sort of some people doing that kind of backyard science. Typically on a shoestring budget, paying for it out of their own pocket, retired electrical engineers, that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't know. I could see like crowdfunding ultimately becoming a way of keeping sort of like scientific research going. On the other hand, a lot of it isn't so compelling. It's not so interesting. So it's not obvious to me that, audiences would pay for most of the research that gets done. But on the other hand, how much of that research really needs to be done on the...
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's certain questions that are signed, you could easily turn into research questions that people want to know the answers to. So I don't think that that's outside the realm of possibility.
And one thing that I wrote in my article about the death of science as well is, if you, sure, it will be difficult if we talk about an alternative model to science to finance or to fund like big technical projects for the time being, right? But on the other hand, if people really need to do scientific experiments on a very tight budget, that might also be a good thing, right? Because you just have to be more innovative, more creative. work on less budget, waste less money, and also you might choose the career because you really are interested in these things and not because of any like monetary advantages, right? So I can see some good also coming out of like a funding crisis, let's say, or like if it's difficult to get the funds. Yeah, just to throw it out there.
Yeah, I think purpose, is important. If you're talking about somebody that's is actually genuinely curious about the answer to the question, they're going to put more effort into engaging in the scientific process it's supposed to be engaged in, using everything they need to use in order to control bias, versus somebody that's just doing it for a paycheck or doing it to try and get published. I think that's what introduces a lot of the systemic error into the system and why we have a replication crisis, for example. Anybody else have any closing thoughts?
My closing thought, I'm actually just going to echo a point that our guest made, which is that it's like all of this makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, that piece of paper that you get from the university is helpful for employers. It's helpful to get your foot in the door for employers, and it's an excellent point. This is the one thing that sort of the ersatz Internet Academy, or for that matter, pod schools and so on, don't really provide. They don't provide that credential, which I think is a very coarse measure of knowledge or ability, especially these days. But right now, it's almost all that we have. And this is something I've written about before, that whoever cracks that problem of figuring it is a superior way to demonstrate proof of work, proof of knowledge, in a sort of secure, replicable fashion, that's better than just having a university degree, I think will contribute to killing the universities once and for all.
Maybe cut out there, John. I was guess on kind of what you were saying. I think we're with the higher education system. I mean, it's obviously it's a cartel, and the credentialism is what props it up. So people are, and it's just, I mean, government money at all stages of the cycle where the education being positional good because it gives you a piece of paper that maybe other people don't have, so you can get your foot in the door sooner. People, confusing correlation with causation. These people with this positional good are doing better, so therefore we just distribute this positional good more widely throughout the country, and more people will, it'll increase everybody's earnings potential by having everybody go to college. And then of course it's just this treadmill where now everybody has a college degree. I mean, I remember Bill Clinton, that was his thing in the State of the Union address at one point, was that making a college degree as universal as a high school diploma. And obviously that's bullshit, because then it becomes just as worthless as a high school diploma. And now everybody has to go to grad school, and everybody, and at some point it just winds up like everything else in our economy. The growth is in these areas that are not productive at all, just suck money out. You have all this growth in administration and, money ultimately generated from the government / Fed, Treasury, whatever their scheme is to create dollars out of nothing, go into, get people indebted, to get this piece of paper that really could be gotten if they cut all the fat out of it much more easily, much less expense. So anyway, yeah, the credentialism is a problem, and I don't know the way out of that, because it's kind of one of those things. As long as everybody's doing it, if you, for example, don't have your kid go to college and get that piece of paper, it puts them at a disadvantage if everybody else does. But maybe that's coming to an end with the coming economic cataclysm, which seems like there's people are getting to a point where it's not so easy to justify the expense of college with the outcomes that it promises or fails to promise now. So, maybe this whole system's coming undone. But pass it along to whoever else has something.
Well, I'll say that there are a couple examples of that. The problems are in industries that have government and monopoly. So like in medicine, there's an allopathic monopoly on surgery and prescription medications. So elsewhere in medicine where you don't require those things, there are certifications that you don't need anything else. Like for musculoskeletal health, you got Pete Egoscu and the Egoscu method. You don't have to have a degree to get certified in his method and start helping people with that. Dr. Stuart McGill, for back pain's got a certification that a lot of people that are just strength coaches get certified in. And then you're able to help take care of people with back pain using non-pharmacological and non-surgical interventions, which is probably best for most of those folks. So the problem is when the government gives a monopoly to people with certain credentials, then there's limited competition. But if you get rid of those barriers, I think the market would quickly fill the gap. I'm not seeing any hands up, and I know we're trying to wrap up. So as I'm saying this, I'll look to see, and if everybody's good, then we'll leave it at that for another episode.
I'm good for just one last thing, because I was thinking about, if I had to sum this up, I think you said it best, Grant. It's like this one size fits all approach is probably the biggest obstacle that we face. And it seems like a lot of people have ideas about potential ways to do it to do it better. And I was going to suggest that maybe over at Skunkworks at Demo Station, I was going to throw my idea up there. And if anybody else, any other member has their own ideas how to fix it, maybe we could approach the problem that way. We could crowdfund a solution together. And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So come join us at Demo Station. So with that, thanks for joining us for another episode of Tonic Discussions on this one on education. See y'all next time.